3, 2, 1.
And go. All right. So for the Sunny 16 rule, if you don't trust your light meter, or if you have a very old manual camera and you're using film, this is how you would use it. For the Sunny 16 rule to work, you need a sunny day, and then the 16 is the key. You set your f-stop, aperture, to f16. Your shutter speed, because you have to do them both, this is a manual world, you're going to set that to the fraction that is whatever your film speed is, because again, we're talking film cameras, right? So if we have it in ISO 100 on a sunny day, we would set our shutter speed to be 1/100th of a second. If we had put in that 400 speed film, we would set our shutter speed to be 1/400th of a second. Even faster, right? 400th is faster, correct? And why would we want it to be faster if we're using a higher film speed? What are you doing, Rob? What are you doing?
Taking out my notes.
That's what I thought you were doing. This is on the PDF on Blackboard.
Well, I like it.
Okay, that's fine. I'm like, what are you taking a picture of? You're scaring me. So,
No, I'm not gonna.
My teaching skills? Yeah, no. So, 400 speed film is more sensitive to light, so you can't let as much light hit it, so 1/400th of a second is faster. So, that's great, but what if your goal on that sunny day with 100 speed film, so 16 and 100, what if you wanted to get some of that blur? So an f16 has everything in focus, right? What if you wanted to go all the way down to a 2.8? All you'd have to do is change your shutter speed, the reciprocal of that. So if you went down from a 16 to an 11, an 8, 5, 6, something, something. Let's say you went down 5 stops. You would go up 5 stops the other way. So you'd go from 1/100th to 1/250th, 1/500th, 1/1000th, 1/2000th, like 1/4000th of a second would be the 5 jumps the other way. Does that make sense? You're letting in more light with the hole, so you have to make your shutter speed super fast so it doesn't overexpose. So you didn't have to stay on 16 on sunny days. You just had to use the reciprocal to balance out the light if you wanted to do something different for artistic purposes, for the purpose of blurring background. So again, these were the basic rules. So if it was an overcast day like today, we'd be probably in that 11 or 8 zone, and then a 1/100th or 1/400th, whatever our film speed was. So, your in-camera light meter, we're lucky, we have those built in. Every time we aim our camera at the subject matter and push down our shutter speed halfway, and it goes beep beep and thinks about it, it's measuring the light, and it's giving us that setting based on whatever we have our camera on. So if it's on auto, it's going to find something that's, like they said, a mid-range aperture that's fast enough that you can hand hold and there won't be shake. If we're on aperture priority mode and we already told it we want to be at 5.6, it's going to meter it and figure out what the shutter speed has to be. So those are built in, but they can get botched up quite easily. So how that works for the botching up is, right, the next thing we're going to talk about is the built-in light meters that you have in your camera and those different metering modes. And your point and shoots are going to have these, and your SLRs are as well. So we have a bunch of options for light metering, and we're going to learn why we have them. So on Canon and Nikon, they're very similar, and this is going to be the same for your Sony and like any Kodaks, Olympus, Fuji, whatever other cameras we might have in here. Canon has 4 different metering options. Nikons have 3, but they're very similar. So the one that your camera is probably in always and or should always be in is this top one, evaluative metering, or on Nikons it's called matrix metering. And this is the little icon that shows up on your camera when you're going through this. This is also a little icon that showed up in that box and bridge when I was showing you the different settings. That was one of the icons that showed up. So what that means is this is the way that your camera evaluates light that it sees in the image. Does it look at the whole picture, partial picture, just the spot, or center weighted average? And it's the same on Nikon. Does it look at the whole scene, one specific spot, or does it give the center of your image the most historical weight when it's trying to figure out your lighting. So back to our video here. Again, I have to stop my recording, and again it disappeared. This is just groovy. If only I could keep the recording going, this would be much faster. So that default metering mode, that's the default one is the matrix or the evaluative one. That's designed to give a good all-around exposure, so that's great. This is an animated GIF going through here, so you can actually see on a point-and-shoot camera, when you look at your menu button, this might be what you see. You can rotate up and down and change things. And when you get to the icon that looks like this, that's your metering mode. On SLRs, to change mine, it's actually at the top of my camera up here. It's on this little screen, so I changed that metering mode up here. But as it rolls through, you can see the difference. I'll wait till it goes back. So center or evaluative, everything is getting weighted. Center weighting, when it comes back, it's looking at the center portion. And then when it's spot metering, you can tell that the spot meter was probably right here in the center where it's really bright. So it's metering the clouds that are super bright, and that's what you told it is important. So it actually made it got a darker exposure so you could see more detail in the clouds, because you aimed that spot meter right there to make sure that it was metering just the clouds. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's a really good metering mode to use when you need to control, when you really want to have perfect control. So the evaluative or matrix metering that we talked about first, this is what it looks like. There's that grid, and it's giving equal weight to all of them. So every cell in here is given equal weighting. However, when your background is really bright, so even like on a snowy day, we don't necessarily have the sun behind us, but the background's bright because there's so much snow, you want to switch into one of these other modes. So center weighted average metering, the one that looks like this, just the open frame, this is the icon that you typically see. About 70% of the metering is done around the center of the viewfinder. So you can see it's metering and counting pretty much the whole scene, but it's giving the most weight to this circle, then the next most weight to this, and then the least amount of statistical weight to this part. So it's making sure that what's in the center is metered correctly. Partial metering or center metering on the other version of camera looks like this full frame with a circle in it. And that's just giving importance to the center circle. Nothing outside it matters, but it's a big circle, right? And then the final one is spot metering. And that looks like this in your little icons. Only that small area, 2 to 4% of your entire screen, wherever you're aiming that and locking in, that's what matters. That's what it's metering off of. So here's some examples of using that. If a person is like, this little boy is up in this tree, it looks, at least to me, to be kind of wintry in the background, kind of bright and bright. But he's in a tree, he's in the shade. You want to make sure the exposure is perfect for his face, so you spot meter to get a proper reading on his face. Here we have some backlighting. You can tell from the sunshine up here that there's backlighting. And here, super bright background, backlighting, white shirt, really a lot of brightness in this that would really throw off the camera meter. And you want to make sure you get the right exposure on the face. So that's how we go about spot metering. Another time you can use it is if you want to, in this instance, let's say this is a white building, and you want to get some detail back behind this door where it's in the shadows. If you were to meter inside here and set your metering based on the light you're getting back from here, you're going to get a brighter exposure, you're going to get better lighting back in here. If you are on a regular lighting meter, light setting, it's probably this white building is going to throw it off, and it's going to say, well, we want this exposed well, this is in the shadow, who cares, this is going to stay in the shadow. So by saying, this is important to me, I want a spot meter back here, it's going to change its behavior and give you a reading based on this. So how do we get these shots where, especially like this one, is this dead center of our frame? This one spot? No. it would actually be here, right, if we're looking through our camera. So how we do that is we aim first up here. So we put our dead center spot right here, and we hold down our shutter halfway in spot metering mode to figure out what exposure we need for this. And then from there, you have an exposure lock button on SLRs. And on a Canon, it's a little star up here that you see, and there's a button right below it. That's what you push. On Nikons, it's a button back here that says AEL, AEL, and AFL. Auto exposure lock, auto focus lock. So you push that down. So I focus in and I meter right on your nose because I got to make sure that your nose is perfect. So I'm square on with you. I halfway down. And then with my thumb, I hit this button and lock in the exposure. Now those numbers are locked in. Now I can recompose. I can put you way over in the corner, lock you in focally, but my exposure settings didn't change. If you don't have exposure lock, when you halfway meter down on your camera on the subject matter and you see the numbers light up, it says 5.6 200th of a second, you'd have to make note of that. If you can't lock it in, you'd have to make note of it, go back out to manual mode in your camera and set those two numbers to match that, and then compose your picture however you want to. So if you have this option, point and shoots probably don't have this option. But if you do, again, on a Canon, it's right here, and on a Nikon, it's here. So this is something we're going to be looking for, and if you have a point and shoot, we do want to see if you have an option to lock your exposure. So here's some examples where it would be really helpful. You'd want to get the right metering on their face. This is a backlit scene. It's got a lot of brightness, but you certainly want to make sure that their faces are well exposed. So you'd meter on their faces, lock it in, and then go ahead and compose the picture however you want and take it. But your exposure settings will stay where you lock them. Good-ish. We'll practice. Histograms. You guys have seen these before because in levels, when we do levels in Photoshop, we have that histogram and we have the mountains of data from black to white and we fiddle around with them. So we're going to look at those, how they relate to photography, and I'm going to learn a little something that's actually kind of sad news. So again, on your camera, some of you can have that histogram showing live, but I would say almost all of you, even on the point and shoots, when you go to review your picture, typically when you hit that review button to see it pull up on your screen, there's other views that you can get, and this is one of them. And when you back out to this view, and here's some screenshots of different views of what it would look like, it also shows you all of the information, how you were set up. So in this case, auto white balance, matrix or evaluative metering, that's what that little icon means. The ISO is at 200, shutter speed 1/60th of a second, aperture 4.8. This thing is exposure compensation, which is at 0, which means those are exactly how it was taken. And this one is flash compensation. So if your camera has that, it allows you to make your flash not output as much, like dim it down a little bit. So here's your histogram. Are there any white pixels or bright white pixels in this image? No. And there's no spike, which is good, but there's really, like in Photoshop, we would probably go into levels and tweak this by pulling our little slider over to make this be the white point, to stretch it out and make it brighter. So we can see from this that it could use a touch more exposure. Do we need a full stop? Probably not, and that's where that exposure compensation would come in, where we could bump it up 1/3 of a stop or a little bit, or 2/3 of a stop. So a histogram at its basics, like we know from Photoshop, is just a bar chart that counts how many pixels are at each different level from pure black to pure white and then everywhere in between. So here's an example of an image that kind of lacks contrast, and you can see it's mainly a darker image. There's a lot more pixels over on the left side of the histogram where they're dark, and there are a few pixels over here in the bright world, and actually there are some that are completely blown out. You see that spike over here? Probably this part, the waves, the splashing of the waves, like there's no detail in here. There's definitely detail up in this. So you can look at an image and a good histogram typically will have a spread all the way across. You will have some dark pixels, you will have some white pixels. The shape of it beyond that means nothing. There is no such thing as a good shape, right? If it were bell-shaped, that would just tell us that it's actually low contrast. Almost all of them are in that middle gray zone. If it were way over here and way over here, we would know that it's a really dark image with a couple of really bright points. So here's our histogram for this image, and it's quite good. So if we look at this one, sky looks good. We see detail in the water. We see detail up in these bright spots, like we can still see detail up in the top of the, whatever that thing is. Here are examples of bumping that auto exposure either down a little bit, too far, or up a little bit. This is too dark. The sky's really rich and maybe what you wanted to see, and there's lots of detail in the whites, but look, we aren't seeing detail down here in the water. That's a problem. This overexposed one, we got the detail back in our dark areas down in the water, but we blew out detail over here. You guys see all the white spots that totally blew out now? That's terrible. So somewhere in between there is this better exposure, where you have darks and whites and all the middle points looking good. So you could intentionally overexpose and underexpose images. The cool thing that we're going to do in a few weeks is we're going to take this perfect shot, we're going to take this intentionally dark shot and this intentionally bright shot, and we're going to merge them all together to make that HDR shot where it blends the best of all three worlds. So exposure compensation, I'm going to want you to look at your cameras, and then we're going to actually break out into groups in a second here. How you get to it depends on your camera. It might be in a menu where you have to go back on your screen and arrow around. It might be on a dial on the top of your camera. On my point and shoot, that's where I find it. Here's what it looks like in a menu. More on a point and shoot. You've got to get to something that looks like this, plus minus 0, and then it's going to bring up your exposure compensation. And on an SLR, typically, you get there by pushing either a button on the top or you go into your menu mode to get to it. On mine, I'm pretty sure I go into menu mode and I find AE, let me see, in mine. So on a Canon.
What is it, EV? Is that what it says?
That's exposure value.
Is that what that is, what we're looking for?
Possibly. I'd have to look at your camera.
I know, I could get there.
So on mine, I go into this back menu, I go to the second option, and my very first one on a Canon says Expo Comp / AEB. That's exposure compensation / auto exposure bracketing, which we'll get to in a second. But I see that scale, and then from here I have to use the wheel at the top of my camera to spin that once I pick it. So I pick it in here, and then I use this wheel. Whoops. I use this lower wheel to change it for exposure compensation. And then exposure bracketing is something different. I use this upper wheel to change that. And this is kind of cool. I'll walk around so you can see this. Do you see how I have a middle point and a right and a left point being set?
So that exposure value makes it darker, lighter?
Yep, by baby steps. This is the version that does bracketing on Canon. So my first shot would be correct, and my second shot would be this much darker or this much lighter. The second and third shots. So there's that version, and then if I use the wheel, I can just bump it up by thirds. So in a second, we're going to actually look at our cameras and figure this out. So this is what it looks like on mine, where I can go up and down by the steps, and then exposure compensation bracketing looks like this.
We're not again here.
So on mine, exposure compensation, I get to it, and then I run this wheel.
I mean, I found this down here, but I don't know how to change it.
Or I use this wheel to bracket it, and then that would give me
Oh.
3 shots.
I thought you meant do this on the screen when you're taking
It'd give me,
I see.
talk about it in slide. It'd give me a shot at the perfect exposure, a shot at the dark, and a shot at the bright. So that's the bracketing version. And this wheel just goes up and down by thirds. So a little bit brighter, a little bit brighter, a little bit darker, a little bit darker. So that's the baby steps, brighter and darker. And then this wheel makes it bracket. So the bracketing that I was talking about, back with film cameras, when you didn't know what you were going to get, you would take one shot at what you thought was the perfect exposure, Then you would take a second shot a little bit darker and a third shot a little bit brighter. That way when you've got your film back, one of those three hopefully worked. That's what bracketing was about. So in the digital world, bracketing, if I set my camera in this mode, I say, here's the perfect exposure, it's at 0, but I also want you to bracket out and give me one a little bit brighter and a little bit darker. Or I can be extreme. I can make this go out wider and say, I want you to give me one really darker and one really brighter. On my camera, when I hold down my shutter, it will fire 3 times. It will take the perfect, the darker, the brighter. On some cameras, you have to push 3 times in a row, but it changes from perfect, dark, bright. If you forget that you're in this mode, and I take a picture of Kyle, and then I walk away, the next picture is going to be a dark one. So then if I forget and I take Jordan's picture, it's going to be dark. My next picture, number 3 in that set, is going to be too bright. Take a picture of Nick, it's too bright. I get him back and I'm like, what the heck? Kyle looks great. These two are dark and bright. Well, I forgot I was in that bracketing where it was doing that for me, and in some cameras you have to manually push your shutter 3 times. So we are going to look at your cameras and see who has exposure bracketing. You may or may not have that, but I suspect you have the basic exposure compensation where you can go up or down in thirds. I suspect that all your cameras have that. So here's an example of a picture, and I just want to show you how on all 3 of them, the f-stop is 4.0. This is your starting image. Shutter speed is 1/500th of a second. Let's say that that's what your camera metered at. This should be good. So you know what? It could be a little bit brighter. I want to go up in baby steps, so use exposure compensation, and they went up 2 baby steps, like 2/3. That's why down here in your screen, like in Bridge, you would see plus 0.7. It's not a full stop that she went up or he went up, the photographer. It's just a baby step. Notice how that's brighter? This next one, they went up a +1. That's a full stop. That's the equivalent of what you could do on your camera just by changing the shutter speed. So it went from 1/500th of a second, which is pretty fast, to 1/250th of a second, which is half that amount of light, or double the amount of light was let in, so you can see how she's brighter. So by doing a +1, it accomplished the same thing as changing a full stop. But this one is a stop somewhere in between. That's why it metered at, or the shutter speed was 1/320th of a second. That's not something you'd find on your dial. To get to that weird number, you got to use those baby steps. All right. So here's what it looks like. The 0 point is exactly how you have your camera set, but you can bump it up by 1/3, 2/3, or a full stop, or bump it down. When we do HDR photography, we're going to intentionally go to +2, which is really bright, and -2, which is really dark. And then we're going to mix all 3 of them together. Color histograms, if your camera allows this, it's like your 3rd view when you're looking at histograms. So here's the overall histogram. If it breaks it out into RGB, you can look at that. They typically are fairly similar, but sometimes there's more red, green, or blue bright points. And again, you may want to look at that, you may not. So, is there such a thing as a bad histogram shape? Let's say that. Not really, right? It just reflects whatever it's seeing as far as dark to light values. What's bad, I guess, is if you have the spike in the white part. So dark images like this are going to have a histogram like this. And you know, you can't, if you chose to brighten this up in Photoshop, it would go from being the silhouette that you intended it to be to something else. So if you intend to get a silhouette, it's going to look, your histogram is going to look like this. This is a picture that you can kind of see. It's a ski hill, so there's some snow here and you can see trees. So it's mainly dark pixels, and then there's a few blips of bright white from the moon. Your snow pictures are the same. They tend to be skewed over to that white side, and again, your camera assumes 18% reflected light. It doesn't believe, because this is going to be way more, so it kind of makes it dingy and gross. So snow exposure tips, remember that if you have a snow mode on your camera, like a point and shoot, go ahead and shoot in that. Otherwise, Use exposure compensation. Tell it, you know what, this is a bright scene. Don't give me dinginess. Give me a little bit more light so that it looks bright. So that's something that you could fix in Photoshop, and we've done that where we just move the levels over to brighten it up. But you can do that in camera too using exposure compensation. Tell it it needs to be brighter. Let in more light. 18% is not reality right now. All right, that makes sense? Okay. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to look at your cameras and see if we can find some of these features before we move on.